My finger's gotten warmed up. It's working now. All right, I will call the next meeting to order. Thank y'all for being here. Can we get a representative from planning? You, and I will start with schools, let you introduce yourself and tell us everything you can about school assignment, please. That I have 3 mics hot. Hopefully that one's one of them.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
My name's Ryan Latimer. I've worked with the school department since 2008, and tonight we're going to kind of go over a presentation on how the district, since around 2004, started looking at generating what was called a student generation rate. And so I'll talk about kind of that formula and show you how it's calculated, and then Lisa's going to kind of go over how planning uses it. Sorry, just getting used to the slide deck here. Basically, each year, one of the things that we do is, just to back up, it's called the student generation factor. Sometimes it's also referred to as a student yield rate. And what do we do is we map each of our students during each year, and we also look at kind of the land use to help determine whether each student's in a single family or multifamily dwelling. And then we also look at the number of units in each school zone, elementary school zone. And this will kind of give us a base ratio, and I'll go into that in a little more detail as we go forward. The example I'm going to walk you through is from Thomas Edison Elementary School, but we use the same process for each zoned elementary school. So in effect, Thomas Edison's student generation ratios would look different than Percy Priest. Julia Green would look different than Hickman Elementary School. And then if you kind of zoom in on it a little bit, you can see the little red dots are students. And then you can kind of see the parcels, and then we start basically classifying whether that student lives in a single family house or a multifamily house. And those classifications come from the Metro Planning, and I believe it's the assessor's office that sets those codes in the database. And then so if you look at Thomas and Edison school zone as a total, there are 2,593 single family units, and roughly 53% of the students in that zone live in single family housing. And there's not a whole lot of multifamily units there, around 462. And 41% of the kids come from that type of housing. And then basically how this works is if a zone change is proposed in Thomas Edison for 100 units, basically it would generate 21 elementary kids, 17 middle kids, and 15 high school students for a total of 53 kids. And Lisa will go into what that triggers in just a second. And then kind of my last slide is to just basically say this process is used by a lot of school districts and planning departments throughout the country. And this is just a slide that MGT of America did for Jefferson County that we helped populate. And you can kind of see that overall, Metro's maybe a little lower than other counties, but it's about 0.56 for every house that's, or 0.56 students would be generated for every house. And then Lisa.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how the planning department utilizes the data that we receive from Metro Schools. You can go ahead to the next one. Thanks. When we are looking at these numbers is when zoning applications are coming in that would result in an increase of residential dwelling units. And so some examples would be if you're rezoning from an RS zoning district to single family to a 1 or 2 family or a multifamily. If you're rezoning from a commercial or industrial to mixed use, a specific plan that would have a specific number of residential units. So anytime you're looking at an increase in density, we are going to be looking at the school generation numbers. The next one, thanks. So we utilize a school calculator which incorporates that quantitative information that we receive from the Metro Nashville Public Schools. What that does is it tells us the number of students that would be generated from an increase in units. We look at their capacity reports that are created every year to determine if schools are under or over capacity. We also utilize the total number of students generated from a project to determine if a school site dedication is required based on the department policy. The information is included in the staff reports that are given to the Planning Commission as well as to the Metro Council for all of those rezonings. In regards to the departmental policy for a school site dedication, if 100 to 159 students are generated from a rezoning, that would indicate that a elementary school site would be needed with a capacity of 500 students, and so on. So as the numbers increase, then the school site dedication also increases. The policy would be that the applicant is required by the Planning Commission policy to offer for dedication a school site compliant with the standards that are in the zoning code, which were the sizes that were on the previous screen. The Board of Education may decline such a dedication if it finds that the site is not needed or desired in that location or at that time. And I think that's what we have.
Great, thank you. I see Councilmember Coleman in the queue.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Lattimore, could you go back to your third slide? You went through it pretty quickly. I have a question there, then I have a few other, but the third slide that you had up. Now, you talked about this slide. What? Now, I don't think this is the one. The next one after that. Okay. Okay. Well, let me ask you this. When applications are made to the Planning Commission, does the school board weigh in on the impact on a particular area prior to the Planning Commission making their decision as to whether or not zoning would be recommended in an area?
No, they do not.
Well, how is it that you can have an impact on what the Planning Commission is doing if, in fact, they're not using the information that you presented?
Your mic should also be.
I'm sorry. The information that's provided from Metro Nashville Public Schools on the generation numbers are the numbers that we utilize in evaluating zone change requests.
Councilman Hank Clay from Metro Nashville Public Schools. I think there was just a confusion of terms there. You asked about the school board. The school board does not weigh in, but the school system administration does weigh in through those numbers that were referred to earlier.
Well, let me see. Okay, the reason you're here because you're explaining this model in terms of how you generate numbers as it relates to planning. Is that correct, Mr. Lattimore?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Now, the information that you're getting, how is that triggered to the Planning Commission in making a recommendation as to whether or not a particular zoning would need not an impact fee, but in reality, that's what it's called, an impact fee, or an increase in funding for that particular area?
The Planning Commission has basically a process set up, or a database rather, where they take these numbers from us. And so if a zone change is coming in, they can put into that system the number of units, and then it will calculate those numbers. And if it hits that threshold that Lisa just went over, then it would trigger a land set aside.
Okay.
And it also kind of calculates just some basic numbers on how many students it's going to add to the existing school zones, and is on the reports they submit to the Planning Commission.
Okay, and in this example where Thomas Elementary is sitting, let's say, for instance, that there's a need for an additional, I guess, classroom size in this particular area, and the school board doesn't recommend a set aside. How will that particular area go about dealing with the students that will be generated?
As the enrollment went up, we would start looking at it as far as the capital budget if there was not a land set aside. So we would trend it out, and if it was going to continue to increase, we would either need to look at adding space somewhere else, or we would look at adjacent school zones and see if there was a possibility to do rezoning.
Well, I don't understand that, because if you're talking about that particular area where Thomas Edison is, and obviously we got a need because the schools are overcrowded based on the numbers we have, and the school board think that there are too many schools in that particular area, but yet we're allowing zoning recommendations to come forward. I don't see the correlation between the numbers you're getting and what the Planning Commission staff is recommending. Is that?
Deferred upon. I guess planning, if y'all want to lay in on that one.
Councilman, I'm making sure I understand the question. So there's a threshold at which that if it produces 100 students, that at that point, then it's the option of schools to make a decision about whether they want to accept a land set aside in that development. But is your question that if it doesn't reach the 100, is it taken into consideration? Is that your question?
No, that's not my question.
Okay.
My question is simply this. If, in fact, this area is crowded, overcrowded, and you already have the school at its current location, and the Planning Commission get these numbers, but yet they're using these numbers to consider recommendation, I'm asking, how are the numbers calculated into the recommendation?
But, well, we would look at, we still have the same triggers, regardless of what the capacity is for the school in that district. The triggers are still the same. So if a development, it's not as though you have a development that finally pushes you over some threshold that then would trigger that development in particular to have to do a set aside that, say, in another situation it wouldn't have to. It's only if you get past that 100 student mark that it triggers that set aside. So if the developments don't get to that point, then regardless of what the school's enrollment is at that time, it wouldn't trigger it. It wouldn't trigger us requiring a set aside.
Well, let's look at it this way, Doug. Let's look at it this way. You go up to 99, right? Net development doesn't require a set aside. Then you consider another development that goes up to 98 because it hadn't reached that threshold. That's our problem. The accumulation of what's already there, the accumulation of what have not been developed but can be developed in the morning, and the numbers that you're getting, I'm suggesting, how do they come together to give us a true readout on whether or not schools reach their capacity, and more importantly, the ratio between teacher and student correlation. Now, I'm not asking you to talk about the correlation between, I'm going to come back to that, the 1 to 21 ratio, they use a 1 to 25 ratio per student. I am simply asking this question, and I've asked the reason we're here is because I asked to have this meeting, okay? So let's get it straight right now. And I have the biggest notion that we're not calculating the population in our schools with the development because the numbers are not jiving up with what's already there and what's being zoned. And if the threshold is 100 and people are going up to 98 or 95 and avoiding the set aside or dedication of land, well, how will we ever catch up and keep our numbers so that our school will not be out of correlation with the population that is growing in the area? And yes, the Southeast, and we talk a lot about the Southeast, and I know it can go on everywhere, but obviously we're out of balance with the housing that's zoned, the houses already there that are not zoned right now in our schools.
Councilman, I don't know what to tell you about the accumulation of smaller developments that don't put off more than 100. Right now, we don't have a policy that allows us, and you alluded to it actually earlier, we don't have a policy right now that allows us to charge an impact fee, which is one of the possible solutions to that issue, is that you could look into creating the policy that would put impact fees on any upzonings, and then use, I would assume that the impact fee would have to be obviously in some sort of cash payment towards the number of students that it generates, and then that's saved up. There are avenues that you could go down, but those aren't policies that either the council has approved or that the Planning Commission has in place today.
Well, again, my question is simply this, is that we don't have a true enough readout to determine the impact of development currently being considered by the planning staff, as well as what's already zoned but has not been built out. And I have worried about that for a long time, because my constituents would say that our schools are overcrowded, but yet the Planning Commission staff with the Nashville Next are suggesting to developers that it's okay to build. It's okay to stack them on top of each other like sardines. But in fact, our schools are bursting at the seam. That's my problem with the correlation between the numbers you're getting from the school staff that goes to the Planning Commission when they recommend to the Planning Commission staff, as they recommend to the Planning Commission, that this development is okay for this area. That's my general concern. I'll stop right there, and I'll just go back to the actual set-aside itself. If, in fact, you denied for that area, is it money that will go into the general fund for a school to be built elsewhere?
I'm sorry.
If, in fact, you determine that it does not meet the threshold.
Correct.
Okay. So is money?
Nothing's being collected to this point.
Nothing is being collected.
No, there's not a financial contribution that's given towards the number of students. It is a land set aside once you cross a threshold, and then that's determined. Depends on where the development is in relationship to where the schools already are, about whether that's a location that's even suitable for a school. That determination is made by the schools. But there is no financial contribution at any level that is required to schools for development today, residential development today.
Right. Now, back to Mr. Lattimore. The decision to place another school, let's say this example that we have with Thomas Edison, we find that it's overcrowded and it's still overcrowded. And how does the school board go about making the determination whether or not another elementary school should be placed in that area and how far away?
We would start to look at the capacity of the surrounding schools, and if there was room, we would look at rezoning. If they were all at or above capacity, or we felt they were going to trend that way, then we would start working into the capital budget a process where we would look for land. Perhaps the year after that, we would ask for money to do the building, and then it would take another year or so for it to get built. And so it's probably a 3-year window to get a new school in place. We would obviously have an extensive community plan around any rezonings.
Okay. Can you tell me your ratio that's preferred in terms of student per teacher ratio?
It varies a little bit. I believe it's 20-1 is a good calculation for elementary schools, 25-1 at middle, and around 30-1 in high schools.
And the Planning Commission, when you make the determination, Mr. Sloan, when you make the determination to recommend a development, do you take in that consideration, the ratio of student per?
I don't believe it is, but are you talking about when council's rezoning the property?
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm talking about.
No, that's not something that we take into consideration in our recommendation for your rezoning.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Glover.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions. In fact, I've got several questions. I saw in the planning policy there, and I've heard, and I'm certainly living it right now, that whenever you have an SP or something along that nature, you're asking for dedication of sites. But my question is, the policy that you have, has that ever been codified in the Metro Council? And if not, why is that?
Oh, hang on.
That's a planning commission policy. It's not something I think that's been considered by the council.
Okay, but I think Councilman Coleman's on track with some things here. So let's just take what we did this afternoon, all right? we've approved a pilot program for an apartment complex that's going to generate 77 students. And Dotson's going to move from 108% to 128% capacity. Then I've got an SP that's coming to you guys that will generate however many number of students. But now that developer, under your policy, is going to be responsible for coming up with 10 acres. And then the other sites around it, and I want to specifically go to Councilman Coleman's, where if another generates 77 units and another one, or 77 students, and another one generates, 65 students or 90 students, all of a sudden Dotson has moved to 200 to 210% capacity, and the only person responsible for picking up the tab for 10 acres is the one that's doing the SP. So I think we do need to look down the path, and I do think the council needs to weigh in on this policy, simply because we need to find somewhere the equity piece. Next is that condition for the land set aside, is that only for SPs?
No, that's for any rezoning that would trigger more than 100 students, or that, according to our calculations, would produce more than 100 students.
Okay, but if there's anything out there right now that's sitting in RS-15 that they go and they buy 200 acres that's already RS-15, that's going to obviously generate more than 100 students, there's no rezoning on that. So what trigger is there for land set aside in that situation?
The student calculation would have been done when the rezoning went through. So, for example, the other project that you mentioned, when it went through in May of 2012, only generated 82 students, but it also had information in the staff report that both the elementary school and middle school were over capacity, and information of what the fiscal liability for approving a rezoning that was over capacity would be, and that was $540,500.
Okay, well, I don't know if we're talking about the same project, because the SP I'm talking about is already an SP. We're just coming in and revising it. And it was done after your 2004 memo that states that this would occur.
Yes, I'm sorry, that was for the MUL project that you referenced earlier. So in a project that's already zoned, that analysis would have been done when it was rezoned. The SP that you referenced did have a set aside in 2007 when it was approved, because they generated 130 students, which was over the 100% or 100 student.
So is that property already there? Tell me, I guess, explain to me how this set aside works. But if it's set aside under that SP, does that acreage already exist?
They have the option of doing or offering property within their development, or a separate 10 acres to the school board.
Okay, well, I'll go back and I'll look at that. In the same memo, it says that in situations where the impact of rezoning can be projected to be greater than 100 students, one of the conditions that be recommended to the Metropolitan Council, the condition of rezoning, that requirement be made by the council. So that's why I think that it does need to come to the council, because even in the memo dated September 17th, 2004, that it was recommended at that time that it come to the council. Then let's go down the road of impact fees, because I think, and I don't think you quite understood my question. If somebody buys 200 acres that's already got an RS-15 sitting on it, there's no rezoning that's going to take place. But yet there's going to be an impact of greater than 100 students. So if they don't go in to do any rezoning whatsoever, my question was, does that trigger a set aside?
Yes, if they meet 100 students, because they're still coming in for I assume they're going to subdivide.
Well, if it's already zoned RS-15.
Well, but being zoned RS-15 and actually having the property subdivided to lots that meet the RS-15 subdivision regulations are different. So if you're saying that they're not coming in for a rezoning, then it's not going to trigger it under the rezoning.
Well, that's kind of the way it reads, but I mean, I guess I'd look for a little more clarification on that, because it's not being rezoned. You may be coming in to do a site plan, but you're not rezoning it. It'll never touch our desk.
Yeah, and depending on how far back you go, then it would have been done. It should have been done at the time of the rezoning. Was when that should have been triggered. That issue should have been raised at that time.
Okay. How many rezonings have triggered the school dedication, and has the school board ever taken advantage of any of those dedications?
I want to say it's triggered about 10, and I don't know that they've ever came to fruition where we've gotten land, whether the development didn't go through or some other process happened.
What is the actual process? Does it go to the board for that, or is that a staff decision?
Oh, too many people, hold on. Okay.
Councilman, we were just discussing that today with our attorney. We're not sure what is required. If we got the land, we're pretty sure it would have to go before the school board. But if we were to deny it, we were checking to see if that has to go before the school board or not, that recommendation.
I would like that answer because, I mean, my guess is, I'm trying to remember when I was on the board, I don't remember us ever accepting any of the land. And I don't believe that since I've been on the board and with the council, I think everything that has been done with schools, the board is actually, or the city has bought the land.
I think that's generally the case. It's so difficult to find an actual school site that suits well for the neighborhood, that works for the other schools or in the district. I would imagine that would be the case. But an overall statement, going back to Ryan literally answered your question, we are getting much more diligent about realizing how valuable land is, making sure that we're retaining land as much as possible, and that as opportunities come up to acquire new land, that we're developing more sophisticated ways of banking that and keeping it for future use. And so I think I would be very surprised if an opportunity came up that we didn't very, very seriously look at it in a way that perhaps wasn't done before.
Okay, so, and this is really kind of my final question. What, if a number of dedications occur, and I think this really kind of goes to one of the questions that Councilman Coleman may have been asking, I don't want to put words in his mouth either, but if a number of dedications go in a particular one cluster and they're all denied, what happens to that property? Is it never taken over by Metro? Does the developers retain it? What happens with that particular property?
Let me make sure I understand, and Ryan, hop in if you understand the question. But you're saying if it's triggered the land set aside,
right,
and yet we have and we don't take advantage of it, what happens to that property?
Right.
We give it up. The developer has it.
That's what. Okay. So there's not land just sitting over there that you guys so land doesn't get dedicated to it. All right. So what is the? So I think that's the process you guys are trying to figure out right now. Does it have to go to the board, or can staff just deny it?
Correct.
When will we know the answer? When do you think you'll have an answer on that?
We've already asked the question to our attorney, and they're trying to determine whether it's written down anywhere or not. So I'll get back with you within a week on that.
Okay, Chair, I think to look at the codification, to be codified under the Metro with the council, considering that, especially with SPs and some of these other things, I really think that we need to have conversation about this because we do have the growth that's occurring now with the apartments, with other acreage that's already sitting out there. I think Councilman Coleman's dead on. There's already properties out there that have been rezoned that maybe haven't been built yet, SPs that haven't been built yet, but are coming. And I think we need to have some very serious conversations about it. And I don't think impact fees are anything that anybody's real excited to talk about, but I think we need to have the conversation. Thank you.
Good point, thank you. Councilmember O'Connell.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question kind of follows on from a couple of my colleagues here, but it's more directly related to the planning process. So based on the triggering numbers we've looked at this evening, I guess, as Metro Schools, based on any of this and the dedication process, is looking at those acreage amounts, how do we know from a planning perspective that, for instance, we are, instead of looking for cheap land way out somewhere that might still serve a zone purpose but has no infrastructure connectivity, is not on any kind of pedestrian or transit corridors, does not facilitate safe routes to schools, et cetera. As this process unfolds, how do we know that we are actually doing our best in land use terms based on what we've seen in tonight's presentation?
If it's not land, if the acreage isn't given straight from the property that's being redeveloped, then it has to be agreed upon. They can't just give us, swampland. they'd have to vet that through the schools and see that that was land that they felt was an appropriate place for a school site.
But I mean,
Yeah,
are there
I would
policies that support that statement?
In practice, our planning and construction department would review any site that was possibly going to be given to us and determine if they could actually build a school on it. They would look at the infrastructure that you're just talking about and see all the safety aspects, the safe routes to schools, the topography, what it would cost to build a school on it, and those other aspects.
Well, and then if not through the dedication process for the future of school siting in Metro, as we are, continuing to grow our overall population, and as a side effect of that, our student population, and that shifts around. I mean, whether or not through the dedication process or not, how is school siting being taken into account to do better than to just, situate only at the extremities and cheapest land and so forth, and actually take advantage of some of the infrastructure and other policies that we're doing through things like Nashville Next?
I would say our planning and construction department's continually looking at land. They work with the Metro Planning Department. They look at the property assessor. And the process continues to get revised, I would say. The communication effort's better on it. Where I think we need more help is trying to find things that could be adaptively reused. A vacant Walmart or a vacant Kmart or something like that. The Lowe's on Nolensville Road was recently converted. Those kinds of areas get harder for us to find in a database. And so those are the kind of areas where we could use some additional help.
And Councilman, I would say about 3 years ago, we entered into much closer relationship with our planning colleagues, and we meet very frequently. We talk about creative reuse. Honestly, we could use some help from you guys. We could use help from you all on helping to communicate with your constituents about what creative reuse does look like, that there are advantages and disadvantages to different types, and helping us communicate what a creative use might actually look like for their kids. And then we've worked for a long time with Councilman Bedney on the idea of giving us a little bit more flexibility, particularly in the urban corridors, on the actual site requirements that are needed for our school.
Great, thank you, everyone.
Hey, Councilman, if I could also echo what Mr. Clay just said, and that is right, that we've, in the last few years, met more often and in more detail, both updating the schools and where we see growth, where we are hearing developers come in and start to look at properties, and we say, look, this is zoned for multifamily. There's a lot of folks looking at this property and some of these others to give them a heads up of where we see growth in the future. And those are conversations we didn't used to have that we're having on a regular basis. And also, as they start to look at school sightings, we look at them to look at infrastructure needs of those sites, to look at advantages of using other facilities that we have nearby, making sure that they're on either collectors or arterials so that there's easy access. So there's a level of communication, I think, going on today that we haven't seen in the past that hadn't gotten us all the way caught up. But I would say that it certainly is, we're moving in the right direction.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Henderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So my questions are similar to Councilman O'Connell's from a land use standpoint. I wonder if you can speak to, it seems like, your process and your policy is evolving to be less reactionary and more proactive, yet it still seems it is kind of caught in the past somewhat. And when, we went out to the periphery and we bought a big farm and we put a big comprehensive high school out there. And so I wonder, are the requirements for the amount of acres per school set by the state, or who sets the 18 acres for an elementary, 35 for a high school, et cetera? Well,
and that's one of the things you do. That's one of the things that Mr. Clay was talking about, was bringing legislation forward to change the required size of school sightings, whether, I forgot now, it's 38 acres for high school. Is that right?
Around that for a high school. I think elementary schools start at 10 acres and then 1 acre per 100 kids.
And we've brought forward legislation year after year after year to council members to try and change those numbers.
Y'all should bring that back.
I can send it to you tomorrow. But we wanted, obviously, that's something that we've worked with schools on as well. I think, Okay. We'll send it over.
Well, and I think too, I mean, Russ and I saw this in Green Hills somewhat when we talked about, renovating Hillsborough High School or starting new. And I feel like at a city, we're somewhat at a transition point where we need to get our constituents and the community have a better understanding of a more urban school model, right? We can't always have this sprawled out one level suburban high school. And so, in the same way that we want to concentrate residential development and things in our corridors, I think we need to look proactively at getting some of our schools in those corridors, because then those kids can ride transit. The infrastructure is already there. But I think, having that community conversation about what a high school can look like, because I think that was really challenging in Green Hills. Like, I was really excited about, was it Perkins and Will, that came here, they'd done more urban model schools. And I thought maybe Green Hills is going to kind of bite on this and do, like a 4-story high school. Shocking. But I think if we start to have that conversation and look at some other models, like planner people, kind of know where we're going, but not necessarily the community. But when you start to have these conversations about the impact that has, I think that's helpful. And then also I wanted to go back as it relates to the land set aside. So that's physical land in that development or off-site per y'all's proposal to them, because you have a list of ones you think might be good for them to pay for? Or, how, and I'd be interested to know too, can you all report on how many times do you decline the land set aside? It's most of the time, right?
Counselor, if I can take your first question.
Yes.
The policy reads, the potential school site can be within the development itself or elsewhere within the cluster, provided the location meets the site conditions and location requirements of the Board of Education.
Okay, so basically, we've got to come at this from changing the amount of, but I guess my question also comes in as we think about this from a land use standpoint. I know one of the challenges in Green Hills was, and I get that from a school community standpoint, you want to have all your playing fields at your school, you want to have everything on site, but what is the potential partnership with parks and things like that around, we've got baseball on site, but actually soccer is going to be over at the fairgrounds.
Well, and what you're describing, it was a lengthy conversation that the schools and planning had recently, where planning, we were pulling together a lot of the properties that were acquired through either back taxes or the flood, where we did the flood buyouts and some other properties like that, to find land that we felt was suitable for greenways, and try to talk with parks. We haven't brought them into the fold just yet, but talk to parks about trading off some of those properties for land on the edges of our parks to possibly use for schools, because oftentimes those are you can use that open space, and the schools can use that open space as well. So cross-using some of the properties that we have, as well as community centers and other facilities that we have nearby, instead of trying to look at them standing alone. And I know that schools was very receptive to that.
And Council Lady, a couple of things. One, we can count land that's adjacent to a school site that's a park as part of that acreage requirement.
Okay, good to
There
know.
are several schools that do that. That's great. It's a great partnership. Secondly, if it's not immediately adjacent, we really have to consider the equity impact on our students, because not all of them have independent transportation. Yellow school bus transportation is just for that area. And of course, we have a great partnership with MTA that some students can take advantage of, but that doesn't apply to everybody. And I just got a text, part of Hillsborough is still 4 stories, just to let you know.
Oh, yes, I apologize. Well, 4 or 6, and it's going to be a great project. I'm not being negative about the project. The community is excited about it. So thank you all for the good work you did. Lots of community charrettes, and I think that was a real model on getting the community engaged in the process and the conversation. One last question, if I may. Impact fees. Can you talk about that? Does that go all the way back to the charter or the state, or where are we on the impact fee conversation? Because it seems to come up in various contexts.
I've asked the legal department for a legal opinion on what is our authority for impact fees.
Okay. And then could we also, I guess, I don't know if you've all looked at that, but peer cities, as far as what the impact that they do. I mean, if you talk to developers, I know, comparatively, come here from Chicago, elsewhere, and certainly we're a development-friendly city and we want to remain so, but comparatively, peer cities, what are they doing in the impact fee space to address these things?
And we are looking at peer cities because one of the other things is not just, the impact fees is probably going to, I'm guessing here, but it's probably going to be more guided by state legislation.
Right.
So I may not be able to compete with the Northeast or the West Coast for that matter on that issue. But when we're looking at impact fees, it does provide us the opportunity to, I think as Councilman Glover was kind of alluding to catch them in the aggregate instead of just waiting for the one large project to end up having to bear the full burden. And it's not just schools. That's true of a lot of things, a lot of different infrastructure. Right. Open space in the Gulch is an issue that would be very difficult to lay at one person's or one development's, doorstep. But if you allow them to do it in the aggregate, it might be much easier to do. The other thing is when in the process are you going to make the requirement to participate? And right now we're doing it at the rezoning stage, but what I want to look at is in the peer cities, are any of them doing it at the permitting stage, which might allow us to do some catch up over rezonings we've done in the past, but the development hasn't happened yet.
Great. Thank you all so much.
Councilmember Withers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the great discussion we're having, and some of my questions have already been answered. One of the things I wanted to comment on, I noticed that on the planning staff reports that school board members are copied on the reports or are listed, and I wanted to be sure that, number one, that's correct. I know that in School Board District 5, we have a new school board member, and sometimes it reflects the current school board member, and sometimes it reflects the past school board member. So if I could just ask our staff to make sure that District 5 always is going to Christian Buggs, number one. But on that theme, I wanted to ask, while it is not the role of the school board to make a zoning decision per se, any more than it's the role of a council member to make a school board decision. Nevertheless, I know for myself, I try to maintain very, very close contact with our school board member and our principals if I can, and our PTO folks. And from time to time, I will provide my feedback either as a council member, just as a representative of the community, or just as a citizen on a school board matter. I wanted to know if in your experience with the Planning Commission, have school board members ever reached out or provided feedback on the potential impact of schools for overcrowding and how that might impact the quality of resources they're able to provide? Just has that ever happened? How would the Planning Commission kind of evaluate that information? Or otherwise, does it simply fall sort of to the council member either to approve or disapprove a rezone based on constituent feedback about the school crowding issue?
I've never been contacted by anyone, but Carrie says that she's received a handful of times. But honestly, I would think that that they probably rely on their staff, that they probably rely on the school administration to inform them on these issues. And instead of reaching out to say me directly, that they would probably reach out to their own staff and look to address those issues. So I don't find it surprising they haven't reached out directly.
I guess sort of related to that, I wanted to touch base a little bit on the adaptive reuse issue. We have, I think, a really great adaptive reuse of an actual school, historic school. Ross School in Laughlin Springs is utilized by Nashville Classical, which they do an amazing job of trying to get all of that apparent drop-off and pick up on that very tiny little street on Ordway. But, that really is a consideration, I think, sometimes for adaptive reuses of buildings, is that they do have an impact on the neighborhood. And I think that's just something that we need to keep looking at. But I'm interested to know, again, we're starting to have some discussions with the school board about how we determine, in some cases with charter schools, where they're going to be located. Is that something that needs to be considered as well as just, can the actual area absorb traffic or other kinds of impacts when we are looking at adaptive reuses to locate a school in a new site. And again, that wouldn't say whether the school itself is appropriate. It would just say, is this site in fact a good site for that school?
And we do, and we've been approached by the charter schools when they're looking for locations, and it's one of the evaluations that we do is whether or not the traffic impact is appropriate at that location. And I'll tell you that I think that that's one of the reasons why there's been some apprehension in the past about reducing the school sizes is the fear of adaptive reuse of smaller buildings that are within the neighborhood and then driving that level of traffic into the neighborhood. And so I know that from discussions in years past with other councils, not anyone from this council, but previous councils, that was a concern of theirs.
All right. Thank you so much for that feedback.
Thank you. Councilmember Kendall.
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll try to do a little wrap up here. This has been a very good meeting. The questions, I think, were greatly received and appreciated. Councilman Coleman, I think, raised some very significant questions. When I served on the board, we also, this was a challenge for us, but I'm glad to see that the Planning Commission and the school board now have taken a proactive role. We generally had to take a reactive role during that period of time. Of course, we didn't have the kind of development going on in Nashville that we have now. And I think one of the things that has to be considered, all of our schools are not overpopulated. Now, in Councilman Coleman's district and all the South Nashville councilmen, I know you have that problem. You've had it for a long time. We had it in 2009 when we did the big rezoning in Nashville, and I fought at that time for them to consider that part of the city. Unfortunately, we were involved with the Hillwood, Pearl High, Pearl Cone cluster primarily at that time. But it's not a cookie cutter, and I guess my concern is every area, some areas we want developers to come in to increase the populations of those schools. We have some severely underpopulated areas in the city, like the Pearl Cone or Whites Creek or even Hillwood. So it's not a question, it's not a cookie cutter thing, and that's why I'm concerned about us having a dedication of property for every developer. I don't know, is that something you all have thought about? Maybe some developers who develop, say, in the Whites Creek area. Whites Creek is a very underpopulated school zone in the high school and in the elementary areas. So I don't know, and as Mr. Clay mentioned, there are a lot of elements that go into this. There's the equity issue as it relates to accessibility. There is the diversity issue as it relates to keeping our schools diversified. There's a charter school issue. Now, when I was on the board, there was a policy that the board had adopted that charter schools, that we would encourage at least, charter schools to locate in areas like yours, Sam, that have these overpopulated schools where we could kind of relieve those schools that were overpopulated. A lot of charter schools chose not to pick that area, and they chose Mr. Withers, East Nashville. But I'm just saying that it's a complicated kind of situation, but I think I'm glad to see that the school board and the planning commission are working. And people, when they say school board, most people are talking about the staff. You know, when people refer out at the school board, they're not really talking about the Board of Education per se. I can't believe that the Board of Education, I know we didn't, I don't know if it ever turned down any property that was dedicated to them unless it was in the swampland or was not appropriate for a building project. You know, the question's been asked, how many times has the school system turned down dedicated property? I don't recall that the board itself has ever turned down dedicated property if it was appropriate property to be used for a school facility, not necessarily in that area where the development is, but obviously if a developer had to provide 10 acres and could provide them in North Nashville, where maybe you need a new school, or in South Nashville, where Mr. Coleman is, then I don't think the school board would turn that down. And it is legally the school board, only the school board has the authority to accept property, not the staff.
Thank you. And Mr. Coleman, I had you in the queue. Did you want to speak again?
Yes, Madam Chair, and I just want to add this one simple point. I'm concerned about student-teacher ratio because that brings on underperforming schools, and as a result, the students in that particular region are not as prepared as they could be. So I'm suggesting that in our new policy workup, we look for ways to ask developers to help us by adding on 2 schools that are there, or setting aside some kind of appropriation for schools in that area. I am not concerned about them developing across town in Jolton or anywhere else, but if they come to that region, the Antioch cluster or the King Ridge cluster, and the school numbers indicate that we're at capacity, well, you can't allow them to escape their responsibility in developing that area. And I also ask that you look at the total number of units that will be in that area, the ones that are already zoned and the ones that are being asked for now. I think all too often we leave out what's already zoned. And if, in fact, developers come in the morning and pull those permits, that may not be included in what we're receiving from you guys in terms of the staff when they recommend zoning at the Planning Commission. So I guess in essence what I'm asking is that you take a real good look at making sure that when you approve zoning in a particular area, Planning Commission staff, that you include the total region and that you find ways that that development could help schools in that area. And if it's adding on to schools or making some other constructive improvements, that would be great. But the way we're doing it now, you can possibly walk away without any impact just because you hadn't met a threshold number. And that hurt our schools, and that hurt the student ratio correlation, and as a direct result, it hurts students in terms of performing, particularly preparing for college and post-high school. So I wanted to make that point clear, and I think that we are making stride, but we have a long ways to go, particularly areas that's going to be crowded. And sure, the Southeast is crowded right now, but it's going to roll around, and I just don't think our formula has caught up to where we are today with the indication that Nashville Next is giving to most of us in terms of wanting to populate our areas that are not so densely populated at this point in time. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to speak?
In response to that, Sam, the Planning Commission would not be the people to make those kind of determinations. I hear what you're saying, and you're exactly right. Class size, a lot of other factors go into it, and the school board makes those kinds of decisions. I'm not debating with you on this, but I think in terms of what a developer provides, that should come from the school board, not from the planning department, because they are the educators. They understand. We did a lot. We have schools in this city that have 15-to-1 pupil-teacher ratio in hard-to-teach areas. So we did that through enhanced options and other kinds of programs. So the school board has done a lot of that over the years, but they need to make that determination in terms of what would be needed, say, at a school like you're talking about, to improve the achievement of the children. It may be class size reduction. It may not be. It may be some other factors that need. It may need more social workers, more counselors, all of those kind of things. But that's not, I don't think that can be built into any kind of formula that the Planning Commission could come up with.
There you go.
Okay. And again, I was talking to people who we have a relationship, and that is the Planning Commission. We're apart, in a sense, from the school board because the only thing we do there is appropriate money. I was talking to people that can actually form legislation, and more importantly, when developers come to our community meeting and neighbors are asking about the overcrowded condition, our own relief is the Planning Commission has approved this recommendation. So I want to make sure that the Planning Commission know what's on the minds and hearts of the people that are sitting there at those community meetings, and I want them to know that developers are saying, well, the Planning Commission didn't recommend anything, what do you want us to do? So I was talking to the only people that can cast my voice in the meeting. But yes, I do realize the distinction between whose responsibility is where, but this is my only connection in terms of zoning as it comes to my district. And the big catch-all is developers are saying the planning commission staff didn't recommend it. What can we do? I want the planning commission staff to tell them, yes, there is something you can do. There's an alternative beside land dedication. I mean, and obviously we have to coordinate that with inside of our policy, but that's the direction I think we need to go in. And if we do that citywide, we won't allow developers to skip around. They're not bad people, but they can possibly avoid a certain area if you already have the necessary schools in that area. And, you know, they continue to build, and that's okay. That's within their parameters. But we need to make sure that they pay their fair share so the students in that particular area are not compromised in any way.
Mr. Clay?
And just for the council's benefit, I want to make sure that we're clear that just because a school is over capacity, that does not impact the student-to-teacher ratio. That the number of students in a school determines how many teachers through student-based budgeting actually are allocated to that school. And so even if the school is overcrowded, whatever is required by state law and enhanced options or other special parameters, the students are still have enough teachers to be able to teach them. They just may be in a portable.
Thank you.
In a portable.
Any other questions? So I would like to thank the representatives from the school and the Planning Commission for being here. We appreciate answering questions, and I'm sure y'all will continue to be available for us. And I'll recap the questions that were asked to make sure we get those answers back. Thank you very much. We're adjourned.